Okay, I'm getting started. Let people file into the webinar. My name is Chris. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. And I'm very happy to be hosting the launch for Demagogue by Larry Tai. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions to the Q&A function on your screen. And you can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. We have the link in the event page, and it's also been reposted in the chat. And it is 10% off for a limited time only. Larry will be in conversation with David Nasaw, and let me introduce them now. David Nasaw recently retired as the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at CUNY's Graduate Center. His biography of Andrew Carnegie was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His biography of William Randolph Hearst, the Chief, won the Bancroft Prize and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize. He has served as a historical consultant for television, and his work has appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, and other periodicals. He resides in New York City, but now is upstate. Larry Tai is the best-selling author of Bobby Kennedy and Satchel, as well as Superman, The Father of Spin, Homelands, and Rising from the Rails, and co-author with Kitty Dukakis of Shop. Previously an award-winning reporter and national writer at the Boston Globe and a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, he now runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship. He lives in Massachusetts. Thank you.
Great. Can I just add one quick thing there? So David has written a lot of great books. The one that I know best is a book that should have won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's a biography of Joe Kennedy, Papa Joe Kennedy, called Patriarch, and it is an extraordinary book. And if for only that reason, I'm really delighted to have him here today. You're muted.
Okay, now I'm back.
Okay.
It's a delight. I wish we were sitting next to each other and looking at an audience, but this is the new normal, and we will make the best of it. Larry Tai is a terrific historian. He began as a journalist, continues to be a journalist, but is as thorough and well-versed a historian as those of us who have made our livings in universities. Bobby Kennedy was a terrific book. You should all get that. And before that, Satchel Paige and Superman. So we go from Satchel to Superman to Bobby Kennedy to Joseph McCarthy. Larry, when you began this book, the elephant in the room right now, and no matter who we are talking about, the current resident of the White House is in our gaze, is on our screen, is lurking there, watching us. When you began this book, was this in a pre-Trump era?
So the day before the 2016 presidential election, I had signed up to write a biography of Barack Obama. And the day after the election, I realized that any book on Barack Obama, looking at his legacy, would take until the end of the era of Trump to really write. And somehow the day after the 2016 election, a book on Joe McCarthy, which seemed like a story too dark to revisit, suddenly looked like a story of today.
So from the very beginning, you see, historians have this terrible dilemma. We write from the present. We can't escape the present. We shouldn't try to escape the present. Nonetheless, it's our task to represent the past as the past. So we're stuck in this time warp, in this past present. We can't forget the present, but we got to write about the past. How'd you deal with that?
So I dealt with it by every day trying to ignore the fact that what I was doing on research from 70 years ago, and what I was reading in that day's newspaper at times got me confused which was which. And I think that there was that temptation to go back and forth too much. And I resolved early on that I would try not to mention the name Donald Trump anywhere but in the preface and in the epilogue of the book. And any connections to be made beyond that were ones that readers could make and that the history would either suggest or not suggest.
Yeah, terrific. I mean, I think that was exactly the way to do it. I mean, you make it clear in the preface that there is a connection, but it's up to the reader, and it cries out. I mean, the reader too is yo-yoing back and forth over a 70-year period. You begin the book. Well, first, before I do that, the title. Did you have that title right away?
So I decided right away that on the one hand, this was a biography of Joe McCarthy, and he is front and center in the book. But I also thought that given the era that I was writing about, and given the fact that I'm intrigued by where McCarthy came from and what kind of an influence he had after his era was over, I'm intrigued by the word demagogue. And I thought that the demagogue perfectly, to me, captured who he was, so it was an appropriate title for him. But the first line in my book, which says what I was trying to do, is this is a book about America's love affair with bullies. And I was really intrigued by why we fell in love with Joe McCarthy and how he was an archetype for everything that came after.
Yeah. Tell me about the liar aspect. I mean, from beginning to end, you establish the fact that McCarthy is the consummate liar. Does he know, and this is the same question that's been asked of the current resident in the White House, does he intentionally lie? Does he sometimes say something that he thinks is true? And is there no shame?
So I want to answer that in a couple ways. One is some of the most surprising things that I found in my research were not when he lied, because I came to expect that he was lying about just about everything. It was in the same way that when I wrote my first book, which was on a man named Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, anytime that I found that Bernays hadn't embellished something at least a little bit, it was surprising to me. I opened the book by talking not about a McCarthy lie, but about a McCarthy unexpected truth. And that was the truth about the fact that he really was a wartime hero, that he had been a tail gunner, whereas we disparaged that became a caricature, calling him Tail Gunner Joe, and that while the press and much of the public didn't believe that he deserved the 12 medals he earned during World War II, that shockingly, his diaries, which had been under lock and key for 60 years, his real-time handwritten World War II diaries, along with letters from his comrades in arms, proved that he may have been a land-based intelligence agent by assignment, but by fact, he was volunteering for missions as a tail gunner, putting himself at risk, and lo and behold, Joe McCarthy was telling the truth about something. Only if you lie often enough, nobody believes you when you're telling the truth, so nobody believed him. But the lies also were intriguing to me, because one of the things that I wanted to understand is when Joe McCarthy launched his crusade against communism in a famous speech in February 1950, where he held up in the air a piece of paper and said, "I have in my hand a list of 205 spies at the State Department." I wanted to know, clearly his list didn't have 205 people. The number changed every day. It didn't have real spies. And I wanted to know whether he believed what he was saying then and over time. And I'm convinced when he started his crusade that he was such an opportunist and so eager to find an issue that would convert him from being a one-term backbench, forgettable senator into somebody who grabbed the spotlight, that he would have said anything. He didn't believe it. He knew he was embellishing. He knew he was lying. But by the end, I'm convinced, and maybe it was from the mind-numbing number of times that he repeated his lies, that he became a true believer of his own cause and actually couldn't tell anymore that there was so much embellishment and lying.
Well, one of the things that wonderful aspects of this book and is that you found treasure troves of sources. I mean, historians live for the possibility of opening a new source, of reading something that nobody has read before. When you began this, first talk about those sources and how they rounded out this book, this picture.
In very brief form, there were three things that I looked at that nobody had before. One was the transcripts, 9,000 pages of transcripts of the hearings that Joe McCarthy held behind closed doors. And those, in fact, were out there in the public record when I started my book. But as the guy who developed those records into a form that they could be released, the official historian of the Senate, he was the one who for a long time had been encouraging me to write this book, a guy named Don Ritchie, who was an extraordinary source and historian. And he said, look, those records are out there, but nobody has ever taken a real look at them. Journalists did the one day after story when we first released them, but those show McCarthy unhinged. So those records alone to me were enough to dig into this. But there were two other kinds of troves that I was eager to find. One was his full military and medical records. And I was convinced that wasn't going to happen. And one day on Cape Cod, my wife and I were out for a very early morning walk. There was an enormous brown box at the head of our driveway. And she said, we've got to check out what that is. And I said, it will be there when we get done with our walk. Well, when I opened that box, it turned out that somebody at the Bethesda Naval Hospital had decided that I ought to see his medical records. And after 50 years, the military and other sources have a right to either keep secret or open up things like those medical records. And those showed some fascinating things to me, which is the fact that he didn't die of what the official coroner's report said he died of, and he died a much more tragic and much more illuminating death in terms of trying to understand his life. The third and best trove of records were all the personal and professional papers that his widow had left 60 years ago, Joe's widow. And in every biography, there have been some really terrific biographies of Joe McCarthy, including by a guy I think is a friend of yours, David, named Oshinsky. And every biography of McCarthy had somewhere in the preface or somewhere, they said, we got all kinds of great new material, but there's one trove that we've never looked at, his personal and professional papers. And I'm convinced that the aging archivist at Marquette thought that he was going to go to his grave without anybody but him ever seeing what these records were. And exactly a week after I told my wife and my publisher that we weren't going to get the records, I got an email from the chief archivist at Marquette saying, to your shock and to my shock, McCarthy's daughter has agreed to let you see those records. And why that happened is, so David, you know me well enough to know that it's not because I'm charming. It happened because some combination of pure luck and my being enough of a pest that I think the only way she could get rid of me was by saying yes, and by my having as an ally a TV journalist named Greta Van Susteren, whose father was Joe McCarthy's best friend. And she became my advocate, and I was truly a pest, and it happened.
That's great. That's great. You mentioned his death. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So
what
the
are the
official
show you?
Right. The records, the coroner's report and every press report said that Joe McCarthy died of acute hepatitis. And that was a wonderfully diplomatic answer on what killed him. the records, and I got to say, I didn't trust myself on analyzing these complicated medical records. So I sat down with a guy who had just left the position of Dean of the Harvard Medical School, another guy who was the editor-in-chief emeritus of the New England Journal of Medicine, and two other smart doctors who specialized in areas like hepatitis. We all sat down and reviewed the records, and they showed that he died of one thing, and that was drinking too much. He died of alcoholism, which induced the DTs and which induced a spike in his fever and which killed him. And that was interesting to me, not just because it refuted what the official record said, but it explained what had happened to Joe McCarthy's life. He had always been a drinker, but the day he was condemned by the Senate in December 1954, after he was embarrassed during the Army McCarthy hearings, his drinking started increasing to dangerous levels. And the doctors over the years documented every increase, exactly how much he was drinking and what kind of an effect it had on him. And one last thing that I want to just mention about those medical records, this may have been one of the first times in American history and one of the last times that there would ever be a medical orderly sitting at the bedside for the last 2 days of the life of a patient, documenting every rant and rave of Joe McCarthy's, everything his nurses and his doctors said, every test. And I'm convinced that that happened. No, those people aren't still around for me to say, why the heck were you there taking all this stuff down? Were you doing it because you knew a biographer was going to come along someday? Well, I'm convinced they did it because they thought this master of conspiracies was that there would be a conspiracy about what had killed him. And there are conspiracies. And I get an email every couple days from somebody saying, was Joe McCarthy murdered? What happened? All these stories floating around. And we have a record, unless they had in cahoots the orderly who was taking down everything, we know he wasn't murdered. We know he died a gradual and really painful death. And we have all of that in black and white.
And he was what, 44?
48 years old,
48.
incredibly young, incredibly young.
What I wonder is, as I'm reading this, your book, he did a lot of damage. I mean, it's clear. And we know that American US history, foreign policy and domestic policy was affected. And you make that clear. Historians aren't supposed to deal in counterfactuals, but you wonder, he did all this damage on, with what, 40% effectiveness because of his drinking? He began in the morning and he drank all day, right?
So what he did, when you look at the records, those 9,000 pages of transcripts about what went on behind closed doors, one of the things that people had pointed out to me who were familiar with the records, and I went through looking for this, you're not supposed to start with the thesis, you're supposed to look at the evidence and then come to the thesis, but people had pointed me in a certain direction and I wanted to see if I had evidence for it. And the evidence that I was looking for was there a difference in his demeanor in the morning when he was sober and after his typical lunch, which was a hamburger, a raw onion, and whiskey? Was there a difference in his demeanor in those hearings? And there was a substantial difference. He was much more likely to berate witnesses and to get angry in the afternoon. He was losing his temper more quickly in the afternoon. And I have two theories about why that happened. One is the drinking that I just mentioned, and you come back from lunch a little bit sloshed, and you're going to have a tougher time holding it together. But the other was something I saw in his medical records, and I can't prove what the effect of this was, but he had bad hemorrhoids. And I think if I were sitting there for 2 hours, they might affect me. If I was sitting there for 8 hours, I'd be ornery, and he was ornery.
But what would have happened if he had gotten his health under control? I mean, would he have created more damage? Would he have wrecked more lives?
So I love counterfactuals, and I want to answer yours, but I want to posit another counterfactual. His top aide when he became chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations at the start of the Congress that began in 1953, he was looking for a chief of staff. They called him chief counsel. And he ended up hiring a guy named Roy Cohn that we all know about, the arrogant and brilliant lawyer, the kingmaker, McCarthy's protege, Trump's tutor. Had he not hired Roy Cohn, he would have, at the behest of a guy that you wrote a brilliant biography of, Papa Joe Kennedy, he would have hired Joe Kennedy's son, Bobby. It was two guys at the end who were in contention for that job. And my counterfactual is, what would have happened if instead of Roy Cohn whispering in Joe McCarthy's ear, it was Bobby Kennedy? Would he have been as good a guy as I think Bobby Kennedy turned out to be later, or would he have been the same ornery guy because he was the boss and Cohn and Kennedy would have been his aides? Would Joe McCarthy have been better if he wasn't a drunk, or would he have been even meaner if he were sober and doing all of this with the clear eye of sobriety? I can't tell you, but I know that what he did involved drinking, and I know that that clearly affected his behavior, and it clearly did make him more angry. So,
well, this is the first time I've read a book in which I sort of was, as I'm reading it, and I'm pleased that he's drinking more and more and more and becoming less and less effective and more irascible. And he loses touch with his environment. He loses touch with his base. He loses touch with his enablers. And part of that has to be because he's not thinking clearly. I want to segue into that to talk about his enablers. What this man got away with, because so few people called him on it. Margaret Chase Smith did. Tidings tried to. Yeah, please.
So the two people you just mentioned, the two people who called him on it, suggest why he had so many enablers who didn't call him on it. A guy named Millard Tidings, a very powerful senator from Maryland, a very buttoned-down guy, called Joe McCarthy on what he had said in his first big speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, made him go through a series of hearings and essentially established that, in his words, McCarthy was a fraud and a hoax. And he got it right. And the price he paid for that was, this happened in the spring of 1950. In November of 1950, this powerful senator who looked like he was unbeatable was beaten by a Republican know-nothing that Joe McCarthy financed, that Joe McCarthy equipped with all the hard-hitting, below-the-belt campaign tactics. And that sent a message, and the message was very simple: beware the bulldozer. And that was what Joe McCarthy would do to you if you took him on. When Margaret Chase Smith took him on, Margaret Chase Smith was a very smart and affable senator from the state of Maine who penned what she called a declaration of conscience. And she was less interested in factually going through and disproving every one of McCarthy's charges. She took the high ground. She went in and basically said, you're an embarrassment to America and our value system. She was a fellow Republican. She got 6 senators to sign this declaration. As soon as she did that, Joe McCarthy, who had offered to help make her vice president, kicked her off his subcommittee. He called her in this beautiful name-calling way that Joe McCarthy had, that his previewed name callers of the future. He called her Snow White and your 6 dwarfs. And he made her life miserable. And what that did was, it said to the Democrats, we're not going to give up any more members. Lyndon Johnson told his members, don't take on Joe McCarthy. It's a Republican responsibility to do that. And the Republicans, who had a tiny margin in the Senate, didn't want to lose their majority, and they weren't about to take on their own guy. And the enabler in chief during all of this was a guy who's gotten a pass from too many historians. and too many smart historians, and that was Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yeah, let me read
Please.
from your book. It's on page 348. You talk about that. You say, and this is from James Wexler, the New York Post. He was not super. He was nourished more by the weakness of those who should have resolutely challenged him, most notably Dwight D. Eisenhower. There must have been many moments when he shook with laughter over the conduct of those he was harassing. Surely he must have enjoyed Mr. Eisenhower's austere refusal to indulge in personalities. And then you say on the next page, in 1954, and in 12 of the 19 years between 1950 and 1968, Americans voted Eisenhower their favorite person in the world. Eisenhower, unlike Tidings and Senator Smith, didn't have anything to fear, or did he? Why was he so lacking in courage?
So one more piece of evidence in terms of Eisenhower, his brother Milton, who was a really good guy, for 2 years was whispering in his ear, saying, take on McCarthy the bully, give up a little bit of your popularity. Eisenhower was the one guy in America who was popular enough that he could have taken on McCarthy. And I think he didn't, partly because if you look at Eisenhower as a general in World War II, or everything about him suggests that if he had a choice of a frontal assault or undermining the enemy and sort of quietly waiting them out, Eisenhower always took the soft approach rather than the direct head-on approach. And I think Eisenhower honestly believed when he was telling his aides during that time, we will only encourage a demagogue by taking him on head-on. When the president attacks somebody, it elevates what they did. He looked at what Truman had done in eventually taking on McCarthy head-on, and McCarthy beat Truman in all of those head-on confrontations. His popularity went up and Truman's never did. And McCarthy said, Truman made a mistake. I'm going to do what a smart historian called Eisenhower's hidden hand approach, which is you do it quietly behind the scenes. I characterize his approach as the empty glove approach, not the hidden hand, where he, for 2 years, did next to nothing. And the price that he paid during those 2 years was lots of people's lives were ruined. Careers were smashed. Movements that should have been free-thinking Americans discussing anything, including leftist views if they had them, were discouraged. And the country paid a huge price. And I think after the fact, Eisenhower realized it. I'm not sure that Eisenhower ever in his memoirs or elsewhere truly apologized for anything, but he came closer to an apology on this than just about anything. And he was defensive enough about it that makes me think he realized he messed up.
But what do you think, Eisenhower was a smart guy. If he had gone after McCarthy, so we're going to do counterfactuals again. If he had gone after McCarthy earlier, would he have succeeded?
So I can't answer the counterfactual on whether he would have succeeded, although I think he would have. What I can say is he deserved, the country deserved his trying, and Milton Eisenhower deserved the brother standing up and saying, I'm going to do the right thing. Among the many people that Joe McCarthy savaged was Eisenhower's brother Milton. And it's just the idea, there were two people that Eisenhower owed it to beyond the country. One was his brother Milton, and the other, and I think this is really significant, was George Marshall. And there was nobody that McCarthy was meaner to than George Marshall. There was nobody that Eisenhower was closer to from his World War II command days than George Marshall. Eisenhower had a speech that he was going to read attacking McCarthy when he was supposed to be campaigning with McCarthy in Wisconsin. But this was before Eisenhower was president. He worried that he might need the state of Wisconsin and the delegates that McCarthy controlled. So then he did it for electoral reasons. After he was president, there was no reason.
And talk about Jack Kennedy.
So if we're talking about lack of profiles and courage,
He was totally missing in action.
So Jack Kennedy said that he didn't vote on McCarthy's condemnation. We can't call it a censure because they never use that word, but Jack Kennedy said he didn't vote on that because he had a bad back, and he did have a bad back, and it was operated on, and that was garbage. The fact was he could have paired his vote with somebody who was going to vote the other way and stood up and said, I'm against McCarthy or I'm for McCarthy. He could have stood up after his operation and said, I would have voted for McCarthy or against McCarthy. Doing that would have alienated his Catholic voting base that liked Joe McCarthy back in Massachusetts, and it would have compromised the guy who the day he came out of the womb, I think wanted to be president and was plotting his campaign, wasn't about to give up on the 50% of Americans who had supported Joe McCarthy. And Jack Kennedy showed a profile in anything but courage. One more reason on Jack Kennedy, without carrying on about this too much. Jack Kennedy was also grateful for a very practical reason to Joe McCarthy. In Jack Kennedy's first race for Senate, he was running against a guy named Lodge, a stalwart Yankee Republican. And Lodge had Joe McCarthy come in and campaigned for Lodge. It could have eaten away and even caused Jack Kennedy to lose because he won by a very narrow 3%. Papa Joe Kennedy said to Lodge, we'd love you to stay out of Massachusetts. Lodge said to McCarthy, we'd love you to stay out of Massachusetts. Lodge set conditions for McCarthy's coming that made it easier for McCarthy to stay out of Massachusetts. Jack Kennedy never liked Joe McCarthy, but he was eternally grateful to him for staying the hell out of Massachusetts. And that's another reason why Jack Kennedy never said how he voted and never voted against Joe McCarthy.
What about the press? If you had been you're a journalist. If you had been the editor of the Globe or the Times or the Post, Washington Post, or the Chicago Tribune, well, not the Chicago Tribune.
Not the Chicago, that's good.
That was owned by McCormick. But do you indict the press as well for being an enabler?
So I start out by saying that Joe McCarthy knew how to play the press than just about anybody, maybe with the exception of Roosevelt and a couple other very savvy presidents. He knew that when he was going to deliver his bombshell of a speech claiming that there were 205 spies in the State Department, that you don't do that in Washington, where the press know who to call on a deadline at the State Department and get a comment. You do it somewhere in an outlying burg like Wheeling, West Virginia, where the reporter who covered it the first day, there were two reporters. One was from the Wheeling Intelligencer, who certainly had never written a story on communists and government and didn't know on an evening deadline who to call in the State Department. And the other were the local Associated Press guys. And McCarthy knew to release a damning report 5 minutes before reporters' deadlines so that his version of the traitors would be page 1 the next day, and the story on the next day's response would be buried in page 24 because McCarthy was out there on page 1 again with his next day's charges. He knew just what the vulnerabilities were, what the behavior was of the press, and he knew how to play it perfectly. But that doesn't justify, I'm sorry, go on.
No,
That doesn't justify what reporters did. And what they did in the early days was even the reporter, the two reporters who would be McCarthy's biggest nemesis in those early days, the most popular columnist in America named Drew Pearson and his sidekick named Jack Anderson, even they were McCarthy buddies and they loved the tips that McCarthy was giving them. And he would hold up a telephone in his Senate office and let them hear the powerful person on the other end of the line and let them take notes on the conversation. He knew just how to feed the press, and the press early on bought into it and didn't ask the tough questions like, where the heck is your list and what are those 205 names? Over time, reporters started asking the questions, and the ones who did suffered the same way that Millard Tydings did. When Drew Pearson started raking McCarthy over his coals, his hot embers of his column and his radio show, Joe McCarthy did two things. One is he physically accosted him at a social club in Washington, where the great Quaker peacemaker Richard Nixon had to step in and save Pearson from getting a real pummeling. And the other is McCarthy went after Pearson's his sponsor of his radio show, a company called the Adam Hat Company. And by attacking Pearson, McCarthy was sending the same message to journalists that he had sent to politicians by attacking Millard Tydings, which is, if you come after me, I'm going to come after you twice as hard, so watch it. And history records as the guy who was the great McCarthy dragon slayer, Edward R. Murrow. Great movie, Good Night and Good Luck, showing Murrow as the hero bringing down the villain, Joe McCarthy. That was bunk. And Edward R. Murrow admitted it. He said, I was late to the game. He did great reporting on Joe McCarthy, but much later, Pearson and guys for the Washington Post and the New York Times and other papers like the Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin papers took on Joe McCarthy at their great peril very early. And I want to just say one last thing, which is I use the word guys because they were all guys. The press corps that was covering Joe McCarthy, there was never a woman other than Mary McGrory that I can think of who was out there at all, because there weren't many women in journalism then.
So the end, the conclusion we draw is that being a bully worked.
So it worked much more effectively than it ought to have. I have a dual reaction to the notion of whether a bully worked. On the one hand, it clearly worked for Joe McCarthy for 4.5 years, from February 1950 to the end of the Army McCarthy hearings, which were his beginning of his political demise. For those 4.5 years, he was the second most popular politician in America, trailing only Dwight Eisenhower. At the beginning of the Army McCarthy hearings in early 1954, his popularity was 50%. 1 in every 2 Americans thought this guy was doing a great job. So by that measure, and by winning election and re-election in Wisconsin, it worked. But like every demagogue in American history, whether it is Huey Long or Theodore Bilbo or George Wallace, in the end, given the rope, every one of them hung themselves. So it worked, but not for long, and America bought into him, but eventually wised up.
Yeah, I would, but in your extraordinary account of the Army McCarthy hearings, first tell our audience what they were, and then let me ask.
Sure. So at the in the fall of 1953, Joe McCarthy charged that the Army at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, this great command and control center run by the Army, but for all the armed services. Joe McCarthy said there were nests of spies there. He said that the famous spy, the atomic spy, Julius Rosenberg, had left nests of spies in this critical base. And he attacked the Army. The Army caved in initially. They also gave special treatment to Roy Cohn's sidekick, a guy named David Shine. And then the Army finally developed a backbone and started pushing back. The Senate realized they had a nightmare in their hands. They relieved Joe McCarthy of his chairmanship of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and they investigated McCarthy in the Army. The most famous set of hearings, other than maybe the Kefauver hearings ever, everybody was tuned in on their television sets watching Joe McCarthy attack the Army and the Army fight back. Those hearings, as I said, he started with a 50% popularity. Over the course of those hearings, much as the Army looked bad, Joe McCarthy went from looking like a hero to looking like the town bully. He pointed a finger. He had a 5 o'clock shadow. He looked like maybe he'd been drinking a bit at some point. And by the end of the hearings, by August of 1954, instead of being at a 50% popularity, he had plummeted to 34%. And that's when it was all over.
Right. But it was McCarthy who shot himself in the foot in the end. I mean, it was when you read your account, it's clear to everyone around McCarthy that he is destroying himself. That if he had shut his mouth, he might have endured, he might have kept a good deal of that popularity. I mean, we can cheer in the end that he fell, that he was defeated, but that cheering is bittersweet. It's tinged with a kind of mourning, especially when you think of the results. I mean, from the very beginning, when he goes after Owen Lattimore, he destroys the American capacity, government's capacity to understand what's going on in China, what's going on in the Far East. It just so happened that a lot of the smartest people had somewhere in their past signed a petition or gone to a meeting that enabled McCarthy to go after him. And there was a general house clearing. And I would say it took decades to, if ever, to get our Foreign Service and the State Department and the CIA back together again.
So I have a chapter called The Body Count, and that looks at two kinds of ways of measuring body count. One is actual people whose careers and lives he ruined, and there were people who committed suicide very clearly because of what Joe McCarthy did. And a young engineer with a wife and a young son who got tangled up in McCarthy's hearings alleging sabotage at the Voice of America. This engineer went to MIT. He was a liaison between the military, the Voice of America, and MIT. And he went to MIT one day and couldn't find the people that he wanted to explain that what he had done was okay and that he wasn't a bad guy, and he wasn't a bad guy. And when he was leaving the campus, he stepped in front of a truck speeding down, or not speeding, a truck going down the street on Mass Ave in front of MIT, and killed himself. And it was ruled a suicide. He had left behind a suicide note, and he essentially said, it was just too much. I knew the dogs were going to come after me, and it was too much. And he was one of a dozen people that we can say pretty definitively that killed themselves. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of people whose careers were ruined, thousands of people who were caught up peripherally, and that is one kind of body count that we can measure. The other price is the one that you were talking about, the people who never went into government or left government, the people who misread the signs of how serious communist threats were. Jack Kennedy and everything he did in starting to get us into Vietnam, and everything Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon did in keeping us in Vietnam, you can trace back to Joe McCarthy, to the fear of being called soft on communism, but also, as you say, to the fact that all the China hands, they call them, the experts in our State Department who understood Southeast Asia and Asia, had gone because McCarthy had scared them away. And it just, the price that we paid in terms of the lack of intellectual discussion about lots of issues that we should have been talking about is extraordinary. I would argue that one of the reasons why we didn't have an Obamacare-like health system earlier was because that was seen as a communist, the word communist to this day. What was the speech last week at Mount Rushmore? Leftist, fascist, something. You raise the specter of socialism 70 years after Joe McCarthy, and in some ways it still carries the bite that it did. He wasn't the beginning of the Red Scare, but he was the one who kept it going beyond the time there were any real 24-karat spies left.
Right. That's why this is such an important book, and that's why this book should be read by everyone who cares about how we got here. um, and worries about some return to the world that was defined by McCarthyism. It is 7:46. Let's take questions. Now are there, if any questions, let me know.
So you go down to,
Okay. There don't seem to be questions, which is fine with
but
me.
do people
because
know how to raise their hand also? If you click on the participants list on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll have some names that come up, and then you can click the button that says raise hand, but maybe there are no questions, even if people know how to raise a hand.
Let's see what happens. Charles.
Oh, well, hi. Yeah. So, Larry, was he in Wisconsin? Could you talk a little bit about his path in Wisconsin and how he got, to the office of senator, and what the milestones were along the way? Was he very popular in Wisconsin? Was he very successful in Wisconsin? Was he the leader of the Wisconsin Republican Party?
So good question. He came from nowhere. He was a circuit judge in rural Wisconsin, in the Appleton area that he had grown up in. The thought of going from a circuit judge to taking on a titan of the Senate like Robert La Follette, who was to Wisconsin what the Kennedys were to Massachusetts or the Tafts to Ohio, the thought of him beating him, coming from nowhere, was extraordinary. The thought of him coming to take on the mantle of the most conservative part of the Republican Party. La Follette was a Republican, but he was a progressive Republican. The stalwart Republicans, the right-wing part of the party, the thought that they were going to give the mantle to a guy, Joe McCarthy, who had started out his political life as a Democrat and as an avid New Deal FDR Democrat, and had one night, probably in the middle of the night, changed his registration. It was only because they had nobody else, and because McCarthy was ruthless in convincing other people not to challenge. And he came along, he promised to fight fair, he fought half fair and half invented stories about La Follette. La Follette was tired, he was older, he wasn't well, and he didn't fight, and he didn't come back to Wisconsin until well into the campaign. So Joe McCarthy ran a trademark McCarthy campaign, taking the high road when it suited him, below the belt hits when it suited him, and he went on to beat La Follette, and then to beat easily the Democrat, and then to go to Washington in 1946 as arguably one of the least prepared people to show up in the Senate that year, a guy who had not paid any dues and who tapped into, he understood well, and it is true to this day, that Wisconsin can be one of the most progressive states in America, and it can be one of the most conservative, and he played brilliantly into that conservative half.
Yeah, 1946 was also an extraordinary year because it was the first year in which the veterans had returned, the soldiers had returned, and were voting and were running on their war records.
Right,
And
so he was running as Tail Gunner Joe.
Yeah, and on the West Coast, Richard Nixon is elected, and on the East Coast, Jack Kennedy is elected in 1946. But they're elected to the House, which is the normal route. What I found extraordinary was that McCarthy goes right for a Senate seat and succeeds. He had tried earlier and failed, which I didn't know about, but he succeeds in 46.
So when he had tried earlier, he had tried in total violation of all the armed services rules. He was actually in the South Pacific running a campaign from there when there was a rule saying nobody who is serving in the armed services will play politics. He had banners strung across his tent and his truck saying Joe McCarthy for Senate. He ran, he lost, he learned some lessons, and he ran the next time, and it was extraordinary that this guy could do that, but maybe no more extraordinary than a backbench, know-nothing senator could go to Wheeling, West Virginia, and come out of there as the darling of the Cold War anti-communist movement.
I know.
He went to Wheeling, West Virginia that night in 1950 with 2 speeches in his briefcase. And this is what kind of an opportunist McCarthy was. One speech was a snoozer on national housing policy, which he actually knew something about. Had he delivered that speech, David, you and I wouldn't be here tonight talking about Joe McCarthy. Instead, he pulled out of his briefcase something he knew nothing about, which was foreign policy and anti-communism. He delivered a barn burner, and he never looked back.
We have a question from,
I would posit that his rise was no more extraordinary than a reality show TV host and failed businessman beating 20 plus candidates to the Republican nomination, then winning 2016.
right.
So no more extraordinary in using precisely Joe's playbook from 70 years ago.
Right. There's an interesting question from Lisa. Lisa asks, what kind of a friend, spouse, colleague was McCarthy? Did people who knew him well find him likable? And if so, why the contradictions between the public and private persona? Question I should have asked. Terrific question.
So it's a great question. And I think that unlike Donald Trump, who I wouldn't, especially if I ever had a chance to go out for a beer with, I wouldn't necessarily want to. Joe McCarthy, I would have loved to have gone out for a beer with because he was an incredibly charming guy when he wanted to be. One of the things that intrigued me about McCarthy when I was writing my Bobby Kennedy book was when Ethel Kennedy said, Joe McCarthy might be a monster to most of America, but to us, he was just plain good fun. And he was an affable guy. That's one of the reasons he got elected. The kind of friend he was a great friend. His friends, even when they were cringing at some of the things he did, never gave up on him, his real, true friends. But he didn't have a whole lot of them. When you live life the way Joe McCarthy did, in the end, it comes down to a handful of friends. And in his case, his best friend was his wife. Jean McCarthy was smarter than Joe, I think, was his aide before she was his girlfriend, before she was his wife. And in the end, the true believers, the truest believers were Jean and Joe McCarthy in the cause of McCarthyism.
Did she try to stop the drinking? Did she?
She tried repeatedly to stop the drinking, no success. She, I am convinced, they tried to have a child, couldn't do it, and adopted a baby just before he died. And I'm convinced one of the reasons she wanted to adopt, one is she wanted a child, but the other was that she thought that having a baby, that he wanted to have a child so much that she thought that might stop the drinking and raise his spirits. And it did raise his spirits. It didn't stop the drinking, and it was too late.
When you looked at the medical records, was it clear earlier? I think already when he's at the beginning of the Army McCarthy hearings, you say he's drinking a quart of whiskey a day.
So
go on, please.
I'm sorry, go on. No, is it clear what the?
Is it clear to his friends and his colleagues that he's drinking himself to death?
Yeah, he almost lost his best friend in the world, this guy who I mentioned earlier, Urban Van Susteren. Van Susteren told him at one point, go ahead and kill yourself, keep drinking, I'll help you. And that was because he was so frustrated with having tried to stop him from drinking. It was apparent to anybody who knew him and had their eyes open that he was out of control, and especially apparent after that 1954 censure. And it was a tragedy. And I also think that at that time, his doctors were recording on his medical records just how much he was drinking, but I don't think they understood. They knew that he was drinking too much, but I don't think they understood exactly how it was killing him, because they never, at least in the record, sounded the alarm that I would like for them to have sounded, and that Gene and his buddies were sounding.
We have a question from Matthew. What was McCarthy's influence on Donald Trump through Roy Cohn?
So it was everything. It was, I want to just give you a couple quick lessons that I think that Roy Cohn passed on from McCarthy to Trump. One was that when you're attacked, you aim a wrecking ball at your assailant. You don't fiddle around with anything. You kick them where it hurts. Another was that when one charge against a manufactured enemy is shown to be hollow, you don't wait any time. You lob that day or the next day a fresh bombshell. There was a lesson that when the news is bad, you blame the newsmen. It was one thing after another where it is too much to call it coincidental that everything that President Trump does in terms of his tactics seemed like they came from Joe McCarthy. And President Trump has said numerous times during his presidency that he sure wishes he had Roy Cohn there at his back. And I think what that really is saying is, I really wish I had Joe McCarthy. Only Trump is smart enough that he uses the word McCarthyism as a slander against his enemies. So he can embrace Roy Cohn and that's okay, but Joe McCarthy is so much of a demagogue and a villain that you don't carry on with his name.
When you read the book, I mean, almost page after page, reading the book in 2020, you see Trump lurking behind McCarthy. I mean, the lies, the exaggeration, the violence of the language. The difference between the two is, or one difference, there are many, is that McCarthy is a wordsmith. He has a way with words. I mean, he's remarkable. I mean, when he goes after you, I mean, he uses nicknames the way Trump does, but much better nicknames. And he has a knife that he twists into you through words.
So you said it better than I could, and I think that there are the similarities, but some might say that Donald Trump is one of the few people who could make Joe McCarthy look good and sit here and talk about him being eloquent or a wordsmith. And I think
I want to, it's 8 o'clock. This has been a terrific, I mean, it's zoomed by, no pun intended. I want to recommend to everybody who's listening to us that they get a hold of this book, that they buy it at Powerhouse Arena, and that they read it and then buy another copy for their friends and colleagues and the people they work with. It is well worth it. And this is the moment where we need to educate ourselves about demagogues, past, present, hopefully not future. Chris?
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely agreed. It was very, very fascinating stuff. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to Larry and David. And thank you to everybody who has questions. If you missed any of the event, we'll have it on YouTube very soon. And again, please buy the book if you haven't already. You have the link on the event page and in the chat. Every book that you buy helps us put on more free events, and it's 10% off for a limited time. Thank you.
So I want to just end by saying one quick thing. Don't just buy my book, buy all of David's books. Starting with The Patriarch, his biography of Joe Kennedy. He is as eloquent in words as he was tonight in action. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.